Capcom has been slinging banger after banger with the Rebirth-era Resident Evil titles, with the only arguable missteps being Village and RE3 Remake, which I honestly would argue, while not a good remake, it's still a good Resident Evil game in its own right, but that's neither here nor there. With Resident Evil Requiem right around the corner and a reported Resident Evil Code Veronica / Resident Evil 0 reportedly in the works, we're not going hungry for more Resident Evil content anytime soon. That being said, I want to turn your attention to RE4's successor for this video. With the ending of Resident Evil 4 Remake in mind, it seems all but guaranteed that RE5 will soon be receiving the same remake treatment, which is in all honesty, super exciting. Resident Evil 5 is an interesting game, due to its being the follow-up to the massively successful and beloved Resident Evil 4, but also because it was the first mainline entry to feature co-op gameplay. While RE5 brings its own flavor and style to the table and stands just fine on its own as a great horror-themed action game, I also think it's a massively flawed game that could use the remake treatment far more than people realize. And I want to use this video to highlight what I think are some of its flaws and some ideas that I have that could make the game better. And yes, I'm a massive fan of both RE4 and the remake, and that is absolutely going to come out in this video. By nature of this coming off as more of a negative video just due to me highlighting the game's blemishes, I want to make it clear that I absolutely love this game. So first I'm going to be talking about what shouldn't be changed to start this video off on a high note, and also to praise what I feel the game got right. So with that being said, let's get into it. First off, and the most important thing, the game absolutely has to stay co-op. There may be a temptation to remove the co-op to give it a more horror feel and to also make it more uniform with the other Resident Evil games, but I feel that this would, one, only serve as a lazy solution, and two, completely miss the point of Resident Evil 5. And at the end of the day, creating scenarios that would actually terrify two players instead of just one is a far less lazy sounding solution. They kind of touch on this with a few situations, when you have objectives that force Chris and Sheva to separate to complete, or situations that separate them without any player choice. I'm more of a fan of the former, to be honest, a bit scarier realizing you have to separate and making the decision to go it alone. Other situations being getting overrun from two different directions and having to rely on your partner to cover your back while you cover theirs. I know it sounds like this is a point I'm making to change it, but I'm really saying these situations were great and should be expanded on, and similar ideas should be used to create more stress and tension. At the end of the day, to remove the co-op, while possibly making the game feel more like the other remakes and giving it a more uniform feel, would also strip Resident Evil 5 of its identity as its own RE game. Part of this does come from bias. Sure, I have many memories of playing through Resident Evil 5 with various friends and family, and would love to make new ones with them in the remake. But I also think playing the game in co-op brings a level of dynamic gameplay that you just can't get anywhere else. I'll use 3 people I've played the game with as examples. My first playthrough of RE5 was with my older brother. We had a very focused and tactical approach to the game. At least that was the mentality, as we were younger and not very skilled, but that was at least the mentality we went in with. Now, my second playthrough, I went through it with my best friend, who is a very fun and goofy guy. He would constantly get me killed whenever he saw an opportunity, and of course I responded in kind. It was a ridiculous playthrough, and I loved it. The last time I played was with my wife, where I acted more as a guide, letting her take the helm and stepping in only when she began to get overwhelmed, as I was much more skilled at this point, acting more as an AI companion than a deliberate partner. All 3 playthroughs, while being technically identical, none of them felt remotely the same as a result of the person I was playing with. Compare that to the original RE4, where you can choose to play differently using different guns and so on, and that can alter the feel of a particular playthrough, and with the dynamic difficulty, it can feel marginally difficult between each playthrough, but it's not going to change drastically between 3 playthroughs the same way it did for RE5. Don't get me wrong, I like Resident Evil 4 far more than Resident Evil 5, but the experiences I've had with Resident Evil 5 playing with various friends and family is in a league of its own and can't be recreated in a single player experience. It's just not possible. I'm gonna make this next point brief because quite frankly, I feel like this goes without saying, but I don't think anything needs to be changed with the setting or the enemy types because of some sort of misplaced guilt that some people feel about fighting indigenous people in Africa. It's the most brain-dead, short-sighted mindset to have that only stands to stifle creativity, both completely and intentionally missing the point of RE5. There are plenty of other videos that perfectly explain this, so I'm not going to go any further than this. Resident Evil 5 was very different from RE4 from a tonal perspective. RE4 felt like a B-action movie that, while a serious plot, didn't take itself seriously in a lot of its narrative, and quite frankly relished in its campiness. While RE5 was very self-serious, that had what looks like to me a lot of unintentional campiness, what with the over-the-top action scenes, the absolute unit that is Chris Jacked Redfield, and the boulder punching that comes with it, and, well, just about all of Wesker too.
Chris.
I feel like with the more serious approach with RE4, there's also going to be a big push to remove a lot of this campiness to give the game a more grounded feel, but I feel like it's these over-the-top characters and moments that made the game so memorable. While I don't think removing them would be necessarily catastrophic, it would lose a piece of its identity in the process. Okay, so now that we've covered things that I think should absolutely not change, let's get into the meat of the video, shall we? The first thing is the ugly-ass filter over the whole game. I never really noticed it back in the day, but damn, it's hard to unsee once you do. I actually have a mod removing the filter, and as you can see, it's a night and day difference. I'll leave a link for the mod that I used down in the description. Seriously, it's rough. The merchant, or lack thereof, is a big part of what worked in RE4, and didn't work in RE5. The merchant in RE4 is one of the most beloved and memorable characters in all of Resident Evil. The fact that we've only had one other dedicated merchant in the series, in the Duke in Resident Evil Village, is nothing short of criminal. And while he may not have been as memorable, it still gave Village more personality, and I would consider it an overall positive for the game. I can think of two ways to put a merchant into RE5. Either one is just use the merchant from RE4. I could see a lot of potential for interesting story beats as a result of that, but I could also see that as an argument stealing a piece of RE4's identity, which is fair, but at a certain point, Resident Evil 5 is just reusing just about everything from RE4 anyways. So, I mean, at a certain point, we're just splitting hairs here. But if that's not a good enough answer, then my backup idea would be to use an existing character in RE5. Renard Fisher would be perfect for this role. If you don't remember him, I don't blame you. He's not very memorable, but I feel that's large in part due to him giving Chris and Sheva their weapons and then dying later in the same mission. This could be a great opportunity to have his story expanded and also give him a more active role in the story. Maybe instead of dying at the beginning of the game, Chris and Sheva save him from the Horde and he dies at the end by Wesker's hand, making it more personal for the players to take Wesker out, something like that. I don't know. I'm not a story writer. But it could also create a more dynamic relationship between Sheva, Chris, and Renard. Like, hey, my only job was to make sure you guys had weapons. Here's your pistols with a little bit of ammo. You want more firepower? You're gonna have to get the cash. Gotta make a living too, you know? This could stand to make RE5 a little more like RE4, while still giving it its own distinct identity. Now, in general, I want to see the knife parrying come from RE4 into the RE5 remake. I don't have a whole lot to say about it because honestly it feels like a no-brainer and you could just make it the exact same way you made it in the remake and it would still be great. Now, I do hesitate kind of to have stealth put into RE5 because it was far more action oriented than 4, so it may feel a little out of place, but I would be interested to see how they would implement it because if they did, I could see a lot of cool co-op stealth sections where you're like taking out camps of Magini together, feeling something like a Spec Ops mission and having one person make a mistake and having the whole thing end in a blazing firefight. That could be really cool. One idea that could be cool is if Chris couldn't stealth but Sheva could, making for some cool asynchronous gameplay where Chris runs in guns blazing while Sheva sneaks past the fight to take out enemies with a knife or complete an objective undetected. To add to a point that I made earlier, maybe could be how they save Renard. This could be even further leaned into with the Wesker fights, Wesker being so blinded by his hatred for Chris that he tends to ignore Sheva, giving her the chance to slip away undetected and get the drop on him during the fights. Now, that being said, I do have one additional point to make, and I think that last one is a perfect segue into this. as long as it's not mandatory. I cannot stress this enough. Part of what made it work in the Resident Evil 4 remake was that you did not have to do it. Not even Ashley's section required you to do any stealth. I don't feel too strongly about stealth in general, as I'm not a huge fan of stealth mechanics, but if done right, this could be a very cool evolution of the Resident Evil 4 remake stealth. One of the weirdly fun and memorable parts of RE4 and the remake was the attaché case, which was later removed for Resident Evil 5 for the more simplified 9-tile setup for weapons, ammo, healing items, etc. While this got the job done for the game, I feel like this is a similar situation as the Merchant. While possibly more streamlined, I don't think this made the game better. In fact, I think it's part of why RE4 is far more memorable than RE5. I imagine the reason for this is that you'd spend less time looking at your inventory if it had less slots. Also, you'd have to pause the game to manage that much inventory. But again, I feel like this is a curse pretending to be a blessing. Inventory management has always been a part of Resident Evil, and I think dumbing it down was a mistake. Now, I feel like this can be overcome by simply letting the game continue to run if you go into the attaché case when your partner isn't, and let the game pause if both players pause or go into the inventory at the same time. Trust the player that they can coordinate when to address inventory, and even give them the same option as an RE4 remake to auto-sort if need be. To somewhat add to this point, I think gun customization was an important part of RE4, and while RE5 did share a similar level-up system, RE5 lacked attachments. I think this comes back to the whole minimalist mentality when it came to inventory, and I think they tried to solve this by having more overall weapons, which isn't inherently a downgrade. I just think customizing weapons is fun and would want to see it return in the remake. This is honestly a no-brainer and will likely be implemented either way, but I would like to see character relationships expanded on how similar relationships were expanded in the Resident Evil 4 remake. I actually don't think the relationships were handled poorly in the original at all, for the record, but I enjoyed how much more they built on Leon and Ashley's relationship in the remake, and especially Louise. Holy crap, what an amazing reimagining of an already great character. I think if done in a similar style, Resident Evil 5 could be just as good, if not better, in the character department, building on Chris and Sheva throughout the game, to where the shoutouts to each other mid-game become more or less friendly, depending on their current standing with each other at a particular part of the game. Not to mention both Josh, Jill, Wesker, and, again, with Reynard. As far as the environment goes, I didn't think I'd have a lot to say about it, but after running through the game again to get footage for this video, I definitely have a few points to make. Resident Evil 5 is incredibly linear. The entire game is basically a long hallway with very little deviation. While I don't think this is a problem for all video games, I do think it's a problem for Resident Evil games. And don't get me wrong, all Resident Evil games are linear, but I would not consider them to be straight hallways the whole way through. RE4 and the remake's maps open up at points, or takes you back through previous areas with new locations open, and while RE5 does open up at points, it's very rare and limited in scope, with Chapter 3-1 and 4-2 being the most noteworthy standouts. As I write this, it occurs to me that 3-1 from RE5 is almost identical to Chapter 4 in Resident Evil 4 Remake, in that they both use boats to traverse a large environment. Nothing wrong with it, just thought I'd point it out because it was interesting. Now, another point is that most of the original game takes place during the day, and while I don't mind most of it, I think it would be cool to see some of those same environments reimagined during the night, as one of the major parts of the game that took place at night was unfortunately one of the worst parts of the game, which is a great segue into my next point. Oh my god, the Nadesu boss fight is one of the worst fights in Resident Evil 5, and I would say a contender for one of the worst boss fights in all of Resident Evil. I know some people didn't like that it was a reused boss from RE4, but honestly that didn't bother me. It's quite clear that this game was riding on the coattails of its predecessor, and I don't think that's always a bad thing if done right. This unfortunately cannot be said about Nadesu. The issue that I have, and probably everybody else in the fucking world has, is that it's a goddamn turret section, and it drags on way too long, even on easier difficulties. El Gigante is one of the most iconic fights in Resident Evil, and this fight honestly would have been better as a shot-for-shot two-player remake of that fight, and honestly, that's what I think they should do with the remake. I don't hate the turret section leading to the boss, but maybe have the vehicle get completely broken when they arrive, or have them run out of gas and continue on foot through the area before Nadesu even arrives. I would love to actually be able to explore the area on foot. I remember the first time I played this game, watching the cutscene of them arriving to this area and thinking, oh crap, it's nighttime, this is gonna be creepy, and being completely disappointed that it's being relegated to this crappy boss fight. This area has the potential to be one of the best sections of the remake if done right. This one is a weird one because I don't know how you solve this problem necessarily, but I'm not a fan of the enemies later in the game having full auto rifles, due to gameplay sections here resulting in crappy cover-based shooting as a result. I don't have an issue with guns being in the game, but I don't like the normal gameplay being upheaved to make it happen. I don't have a solution for this other than a scorched earth approach to just get rid of enemies having guns, but that kind of feels like a cop-out answer without much thought. Maybe you'd have a better idea. Let me know if you do. I'm genuinely curious. Alright, this is my last topic. I think Sheva was a great character for the Resident Evil cast, and it was a crime that she just fell off of a cliff after the credits rolled. Not even a whisper of her existence after this game. This seems to be a common trend in Resident Evil. I understand Luis as he died in Resident Evil 4, but Sheva, Billy, Carlos, Rebecca for the longest time, and she's only shown up in the Resident Evil CGI movies, Afterlife and possibly Vendetta, I honestly can't remember. But in almost all cases, I feel like these are great characters that could absolutely make a return with no problem. So this is less of a criticism of Resident Evil 5 and more so of a criticism of Capcom not using their vast character backlog and only keeping a few mainstays. That's pretty much everything I've got. If you like the video, give it a like. If you dislike the video, give it a dislike. I really want to spark up a conversation about this and get some more ideas going of what could make an inevitable remake better. So let me know what you think. Anyways, if you made it this far, holy crap, thank you. I also want to thank Yourfavoriteson for the inspiration for this video. I watched his video retrospective on RE5, and it got me thinking about the impending RE5 remake and what could be improved on to make it an overall better game. I'll leave a link in his video in the description so you can check it out if you like. He makes really great analysis videos and is worth watching if you like that kind of content. And if you find yourself watching this video at any point, thanks for the inspiration, son.